The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are simply that, opinions. All are presumed innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. Sensitive topics are discussed. Discretion is advised.
Vicki and Gerald Monroe's dream of owning and operating a Louisville bar together came to a tragic end when Vicki found her husband shot dead and the cash register emptied in an apparent robbery. But the authenticity of the anguish in her 911 call was called into question when a car identified by an eyewitness led back to the couple's son Leslie, who pointed the finger at his mother for the murder. I'm Vinny Politan, and on this week's Court TV podcast, we're diving deeper into this case with an audio edition of our original series, Accomplice to Murder, which takes a closer look at the cases and verdicts that may not be as straightforward as initially thought.
This is the Court TV podcast with Vinny Politan.
Tavern was your little hole-in-the-wall neighborhood bar.
Is he bleeding? Yeah,
I was concerned that this was a random robbery and we were never going to know who did this to him.
It became abundantly clear that Leslie Emerson could not have been the mastermind behind this.
Everything just came crashing down. She could very well walk out a free woman.
We're here today in Louisville, Kentucky, home of Muhammad Ali, the Louisville Slugger, and of course the Kentucky Derby. Louisville is also known as Bourbon City, and every year bars like this are born. Their owners trying to live their dreams of serving up Kentucky bourbon and mint juleps into a reality. But for one couple, that dream led to a family betrayal and ended with murder.
The alcohol was always flowing here at this cozy dive bar on the outskirts of Louisville, Kentucky.
The Bulls and Bears Tavern was your little hole-in-the-wall neighborhood bar.
Good bar food, good cold beer, great people, you felt safe.
The Bulls and Bears was owned by Jerry Monroe.
The owner was very nice. Put up with us. Sometimes his bikers can be loud, obnoxious, rowdy. He enjoyed the people that he was around.
My dad was in love with being in love.
Angel was Jerry's oldest child from a significant number of marriages.
He married, I believe, 6 times. Once it became work, I think that's when he was ready to move on and look for something else.
But then, Angel started hearing about a new woman in her father's life, one who seemed different from the others.
He told me that he had someone special that he wanted me to meet, and so he drove me over to where she worked at that time.
Vicki was a bartender at the Bulls and Bears Tavern, where Jerry was a regular.
I think he really did want to be finished with looking for someone. I think he wanted her to be that person.
Hi, Gerald, Vicki. Didn't talk with you. Be my lawfully wedded wife.
My dad and Vicki were married at the bar that they met in. He was very dapper in his cowboy attire, and she looked pretty.
Even more so than Jerry, Vicki loved the Bulls and Bears, and just a month after getting married, she convinced her husband to buy the place.
I believe that the bar meant to Vicki status, security, a sense of pride and achievement. I don't think he ever would have done this without her. It gave him satisfaction that he could do this for someone else. He was giving someone their dream, and then he was helping them keep that dream.
But that dream would be cut tragically short when just 2 years after their wedding, Vicki called 911 from the Bulls and Bears.
I need somebody here, please. I'm sorry. Is he bleeding? Yeah. Oh my God. Okay, can you take the phone to where he is?
When police arrived on the scene, they found a distraught Vicki and the body of Jerry Monroe lying dead next to the cash register, which had been emptied of around $500 in cash.
Vicki was the one that told me how he died. She gave me the details that he had been shot and that she had gone to the bar because he didn't come home, and she found him there, shot to death on the floor of their bar.
And initially, robbery seemed like a reasonable motive.
There is apartment buildings behind it, and kind of a shady little area back there. And a lot of the pendulum was swinging, saying that it was probably some guys, whoever, back there came over to rob him.
In this situation, I recall that there weren't any necessarily strong leads. A lot of the times family members are first, suspects, but generally primarily for the purposes of being excluded.
When investigators first interviewed Vicki about her husband's murder, she came across as genuinely shattered by his death.
I'm asking you, what do you think happened and why do you think that Jerry was killed?
I just can't see anybody hurting Jerry. Jerry could see a pain in the rear, but never, no.
Was there anybody that you know of that would want to see Jerry dead?
No.
For any reason?
No.
There wasn't a smoking gun, so to speak. There was some concern that the individual who had perpetrated this crime would not be identified and subsequently prosecuted.
I was concerned that this was one of those random acts of violence, a random robbery, and we were never going to know who did this to him. We were never going to get justice for him.
And then, thanks to a vigilant woman who liked to watch the local news and a chance encounter that raised suspicions, the case took an entirely unexpected turn.
I'd had a bad dream. Woke up just before daylight, and I decided to go get coffee at McDonald's for my husband and myself because we were going to do some work.
As she turned onto the main road and came to the top of a hill, she saw a car at the bottom, stopped by the bridge over a small creek. Sandra Higgins walked me through what happened next.
I was at the top of the hill, and there's a car parked down there with its trunk open and passenger door open, and there's a young man that came from the guardrail, bent over. He had a rag in his hand. He slid up beside the car and got in the open car door.
How suspicious were you? Did you think this was just car trouble or there was something amiss here?
Well, he's getting rid of something, and he's hiding. So I'm pretty sure something's wrong, really sure.
She then saw another man get into the car and pulled it back onto the road, coming up the hill towards her.
So they drive past me, and they wouldn't look at me. And so I'm going to McDonald's for coffee, but I'm going to report this because I think you should.
And that's when she got the fright of her life as the car did a U-turn and began to follow her. As she fumbled for her cell phone to call 911, she turned off the road and into this cemetery where she parked.
When I looked in the rearview mirror and the driver was getting out of the car, coming up to me, he said, I saw you back there, you look scared. And he said, I just wanted to tell you that we're looking for my hubcap. And the reason he had that rag in his hand is he's leaning over the guardrail and he doesn't want to get his hands dirty.
And 911 was on the line at this moment?
Oh, yeah. I raised up my phone then. I put my hand on the window to roll it up, and I said, well, if I find it, I'll let you know. And I see him get back in the car, pull out, and leave.
With the driver so close, Sandra was able to get a good look at him.
He had tattoos up and down his arm. He had several earrings in, and he was almost skinhead, but there was a little hair on his head.
But if he hadn't followed you and came up to your car, would you have been able to identify him?
No, I would not.
When she got home, she told her husband, Mike, she'd called 911 after what she'd seen.
I told Mike the story, and he said, now, Sandy, you know, I think you may have just overdone this. I didn't argue with him. I just told him, if there's been a murder today on the news, I'm going to watch it, and I'm calling them back.
Sure enough, that evening, Jerry Monroe's death made the local news. So she called the police and reminded them of what she had seen.
And then I said, does this have anything to do with the murder that I saw on the news? And she said, it may, ma'am.
Sandra's description of the vehicle she saw matched a car that police had pulled over that same night. Before letting him go, they had identified him as 21-year-old Leslie Emerson, who also happened to be Vicki Monroe's son. The police asked Sandra to attend the funeral service being held for Jerry Monroe.
And he was the last one to show up at the funeral home. And I cannot express with words what that was like. I mean, it was really him.
When police brought Leslie Emerson in for questioning, he almost immediately confessed to the murder of Jerry Monroe. He told police that after shooting Jerry with a rifle, he'd taken $500 from the cash register and stolen some cigarettes. He then told police that he'd buried the rifle next to the creek where he'd been spotted by Sandra Higgins. But something about his confession didn't add up.
It became abundantly clear that Leslie Emerson could not have been the mastermind behind this. He was a bit obtuse, he was a bit dense, he was a bit naive. He just wasn't the type of personality that you would think would, even on impulse, commit a crime such as this.
After some additional questioning, that's when Leslie dropped a bombshell. He told investigators that Vicki was the one behind Gary's murder, and with the life insurance they'd receive, I wouldn't have to worry about living check to check and taking care of my kids.
I don't think anybody ever suspected that a mother would hire her son to kill her husband, and it was Mr. Emerson who brought that to light.
When we return, Vicki Monroe goes on trial for hiring her own son to kill her husband, Jerry.
After citizen sleuth Sandra Higgins caught Leslie Emerson disposing of the rifle used to kill Jerry Monroe, Leslie had confessed to the crime. But he insisted he was only an accomplice and that it was his mother, Vicki, who came up with the plan to kill her husband. Armed with Leslie's confession, police brought Vicki back in for questioning over multiple days. On the third day, she admitted she'd confided in her son about Jerry that she wanted it over and couldn't take it anymore. She said he'd told her, "Mom, there's ways to take care of that." When she asked, what would it take? He said $5,000, around there. She said she'd paid him $2,000 at the time, but that she just assumed he spent it on bills because nothing was ever done. Based on their statements, prosecutors charged Vicki with solicitation to commit murder and Leslie with murder, and then arrested both of them.
I got a phone call from my uncle, and he said, Angel, I want you to know that the police arrested the people responsible. I'm like, great, who is it? And he said, it was Vicki and Leslie. I was in such shock. And it was one of those phones, it was a wall phone with a cord that was like 20 miles long. And when he said that, I remember dropping the phone and the phone just zipping across the room. I was so shocked.
But while Leslie Emerson was facing death for murdering Jerry Monroe, the prosecution was more interested in bringing Vicki to justice.
For someone to be as diabolical as Vicki was, to involve her son in this conduct, we felt as though, even though he's not a victim, so to speak, but for Vicki, this never happens.
Prosecutors offered Leslie a deal.
If he provided truthful and accurate testimony, we would be willing to negotiate something less than death.
Vicki had been accused of being the mastermind behind the murder-for-hire plot of her husband, Jerry, by her own son, Leslie. And prosecutors wanted to use that confession to put Vicki away for murder.
The trial got underway here at the Jefferson Judicial Center in March of 2004. While court TV cameras were not initially present, we were able to obtain footage from the clerk's office. Alex Daythorne was one of the lead prosecutors.
Bam! Gunshot to the head, twice. That's how Jerry died, in the Bulls and Bear Tavern, June 1st, 2002, here in Jefferson County. What a way to go.
That first trial, I naively thought, this is a slam dunk case. The person who pulled the trigger is willing to testify to the person who paid him.
Leslie's going to come in here and he's going to testify. And he's going to tell you exactly what happened.
I don't believe we ever suspected that he was not going to fulfill his obligations and his portion of the agreement that we had struck with him.
But that's exactly what happened.
And they said, Angel, he's not going to do it. He has decided he will not testify against her. And I howled like a wounded animal. My mother heard me from inside the courtroom.
It takes a lot to surprise me after many years as I've been doing this. It was a little bit of a shock, disbelief, and then I just got pissed. I really started originally questioning myself as to whether we had been played. That would be an extremely clever legal maneuver. Back out of the agreement, knowing that now the likelihood of his mother's conviction had probably gone way down without his testimony.
Because the jury had already been sworn, we had to proceed with the trial. So we had to do the best that we could with what we had and without Leslie Emerson.
Everything just came crashing down. She could very well walk out a free woman.
The prosecution and Jerry's loved ones held their breath as the jury retired to deliberate. In the end, they deadlocked.
We must have tried a good enough a case to at least give that jury some pause as to whether she did it or she didn't. But I think the deadlock was probably the best thing that could happen for the prosecution.
At least she's not guilty. We have another chance at this. She's not going to get to walk out.
And now, Leslie was going to have to face the consequences of pulling out of the plea deal as the death penalty was once again put back on the table.
We had a lot of evidence against Leslie. We had the murder weapon, we had all of his incriminating statements. Of course, you never know what a jury might do. I almost was afraid they would feel sorry for him, that his mother caused him to commit this murder.
Indeed, that's exactly what Leslie Emerson's lawyer, Sheila Seidler, attempted to do, arguing that Leslie was also one of Vicki Monroe's victims.
She manipulated Leslie. She preyed upon his obvious weaknesses, get him to do what she wanted him to do. If it weren't for Vicki Monroe and the pressure that she put upon Leslie to kill her husband, Gerald Monroe would be alive today.
On November 30th of 2004, a jury found Leslie guilty of murdering his stepfather, Jerry. but they spared him the death penalty, and Leslie was sentenced to 25 years in prison. With Leslie behind bars, the prosecutors turned their attention once again to the person they considered the real mastermind behind Jerry Monroe's death, his wife, Vicki. Take two began here in January of 2005, and as usual, Angel was present for all of it.
I was there all the time, even before the trial, the pre-trial hearings, the motions. Anytime there was an appointment open at that court to do with the case, I was always there.
Without Leslie's testimony, the prosecution relied on two witnesses who had first-hand knowledge of the plot: Leslie's girlfriend Amanda and her brother Justin Cruz.
The way we got them in was as a conspirators' hearsay statements. We did rely on the federal law for our arguments, and the judge agreed with us that these statements should come in. When did you first learn that someone was planning to kill Jerry Monroe?
2 months before his death.
And do you recall what he said to you?
He told me that his mother wanted him to kill Jerry.
What else did he ask you then?
He asked me if I knew how to make a silencer.
Leslie's girlfriend and the mother of his child testified next.
Did you ever notice the relationship between Leslie and his mother changed?
Yes. When he come to me and told me that she wanted Jerry killed.
Did he say how that was going to be accomplished?
She wanted him to hire someone.
This time, the jury was unanimous. They found Vicki Monroe guilty as charged, and she was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Angel finally had closure on her father's murder. Or did she?
Vicki Monroe had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years for paying her son to kill her husband. But when the case reached the Kentucky Supreme Court, the justices concluded that the conviction was based upon statements they never should have been allowed to hear.
Ironically, the testimony from star witnesses Justin and Amanda Cruz, the key to Vicki's initial conviction, now set her free as the High Court sent the case back for yet another retrial.
We felt like we had a legal basis for introducing those statements. And the trial court agreed, but of course the Supreme Court did not, and that's what mattered.
But Carol Cobb and her partner were not about to quit.
People should face the consequences of their actions, especially when they involve harm to other people. And as long as I'm able to pursue it until I'm shut down by a not guilty verdict, then I'm going to do it.
I get a call from Carol, and she said, "Angel, I am so sorry. We have to do this again." Just when I thought this is done, I can move forward. I can start to really heal and put this behind me. I can't. I gotta get ready to testify again. I gotta go and fight for him again.
It had been 6 years since Jerry Monroe had been murdered in the bar that he loved so much. In November of 2008, prosecutors made their third attempt to convict Vicki Monroe for orchestrating his murder.
You will be asked to find the defendant, Vicki Monroe, guilty for her role in the death of Gerald Monroe.
We wanted to get justice for this family, and it had been going on for 6 years. Even though we had a good case, we were still anxious.
He was left for dead at the Bulls and Bears Tavern, the same place where he met Vicki Monroe, the same place where he fell in love with Vicki Monroe, the same place where he married Vicki Monroe, the same place where he tried.
There's a lot to be angry about in this case. He pulled the trigger, she was the mastermind. They took him from this earth, and they left him lying in a pool of blood in a bar.
In a long shot, the prosecution called the trigger man himself to the stand.
The Commonwealth intends to call you as a witness in this case, and I just need to know from you if you will answer questions of the Commonwealth this time.
Nope.
And could you tell the court why you won't answer the questions?
Unfortunately for the prosecution, Leslie refused once again to testify against his mother.
I need a reason. you normally would need a reason.
I don't want to.
Leslie's refusal to testify also meant the prosecution couldn't use any of his former statements against Vicki. And the higher court had tied their hands in other ways.
We could only use 3 of the statements that we had previously used, and they were not nearly as strong as the ones that the Supreme Court said we could not use.
Unable to use any of their smoking guns, the prosecution instead set about building a circumstantial case showing that Vicki wanted her husband dead and almost literally danced on his grave.
The buzz in the funeral home was, after hours here, we're all going to go back to the bar and she's going to open it up. And I remember being so offended by this. And I said, no, I'm not going to go because it's a crime scene, because there's blood on the floor.
Tammy Parsons, a bartender at the Bull and Bear, testified that Vicki didn't exactly seem like a grieving widow that evening.
Then they just started partying and people were giving her drugs and stuff, and all of a sudden she was like, woohoo, time to party. And everybody just kind of looked at her like, what was going on, you know? You're not supposed to be like being excited and joyful.
Okay.
You know, your husband just passed away.
And I'm sorry, what were people giving her?
Drugs. Don't ask me what kind, because I don't know. I just saw pills swapping.
Okay.
Tammy also testified about another motive Vicki may have had for murder, Jerry's wandering eye.
You said that Vicki had suspicions about Gerald and a woman named Veronica. What'd she say?
She said, I know that is my husband.
Another bartender, Deborah Anderson, also testified about Vicki's behavior the night of Jerry's funeral.
And could you describe what you saw or heard that night?
Well, when she got there, she was having some drinks, and then they started playing music, and she was dancing.
And you said she was dancing?
Yes.
What kind of dancing was she doing?
I would say like dirty dancing.
Okay. And what do you mean by dirty dancing by that?
Well, she was like rubbing up all over the guy that she was dancing with, and like in the movie.
Deborah also testified that before the murder, Vicki confided in her about her marriage.
She told me that she thought that Jerry was going to divorce her, and that she could not lose that bar.
And how did you respond to that?
I told her that I didn't think that he could just take it totally away from her, and she told me, she said, that's not an option. I'm not losing this bar.
The prosecution also pointed towards financial problems that Vicki feared might lead to the loss of the bar she loved so much.
We had those layers of the financial difficulties, and the focus became much more the desperation of Vicki.
The prosecution called on bartender Richard Lyons to talk about that desperation.
You said at first they were getting along great.
Everything seemed fine up until the time when he quit Bob Hook Chevrolet.
Okay.
That seemed like the breaking point.
Okay. And what happened when he quit working at Bob Hook Chevrolet?
Well, she knew that that was their insurance, the extra money, and just their little bit of security they had to fall back on, that they were going to lose that.
It was around that time the prosecution alleges Vicki's thoughts turned to murder.
Lo and behold, the defendant had a safety net that would help her out of this marriage that was failing, and that would help her keep the bar. She had a $50,000 life insurance policy on Gerald Monroe.
Prosecutors in the trial of Vicki Monroe for the murder of her husband Jerry had been forced to make a largely circumstantial case after multiple incriminating statements by her son and accomplice Leslie were thrown out. So prosecutors pivoted.
If we can't use Leslie's statements, let's use Vicki's.
She tried to explain those away, that she had changed her mind, or that's not what she really meant. But she did make some incriminating statements that we were able to use against her at trial.
The prosecution called Marcy Davis to the stand, the lead detective who interviewed Vicki after the murder.
When she came in to see you on the 12th of June, could you describe her demeanor that day as you met with her?
She was quiet. Occasionally she would shake. I pulled up a chair and she said, "Marcy, no, no." And she was shaking her head and I said, "No, what?" And she repeatedly said, "I can't believe my son would pull the trigger." And when I advised her that he did, she said, "If he did it for me."
So you said if Les did because of you, if he shot Jerry because of you, that you might have said some things that he misunderstood, that he took too literally. Okay, and things like what? But you never asked Leslie to kill him.
But as Davis continued to press her, Vicki walked right up to the edge of confessing that she'd hired Leslie to kill Jerry.
She stated that a year or so ago, when she was upset, she had had a conversation with Leslie. And during that conversation, she told him that she couldn't take it anymore and that she wanted it over.
Did he discuss having somebody get rid of you? His mom was take care of that. Okay. And what did you say to that? What would he take? Would it be exact one? Would it take $5,000 payment down there? And so a year or so ago, you gave him $2,000. Gave him $2,000. Okay. And whatever happened to that money? I just assume that he's spending on pills or something because nothing's ever done. I went on. So were you expecting something to be done? A year or so ago, yeah.
One thing that we had to show was that she didn't change her mind, which is kind of what she tried to say to the police. Well, you know, I didn't think it would ever get done, so I just kind of forgot about it.
To get in front of that defense, the prosecution highlighted the cell phone records between Vicki and her son. Those records showed a huge spike in the number of calls from Vicki's cell phone to Leslie's in the months leading up to the murder, as well as 2 suspicious calls early in the morning of the murder.
There's a call appearing in the records on June 1st at 3:25 a.m.
Okay. We were able to show the increase in telephone calls that she made to him in the weeks leading up to the murder, and they were just off the charts.
The prosecution called Jerry's daughter Angel to the stand to remind the jury the true cost of Vicki's scheme.
No matter how Vicki felt about her husband, that was someone's father, that was someone's son, that was someone's friend.
Could you state your name for the record, please?
It is Angel Marie Monroe. It was up to me to be his voice and to bring him to life.
And ask you if we can identify this photograph for us,
please. Yes, that's it's my father and me the day I graduated basic training.
Your Honor, would ask you.
Angel echoed other witness testimony that Vicki believed Jerry was leading them into financial ruin.
She had a conversation with me where she was complaining to me about their finances. She said that they had gotten into such financial trouble, they were robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I remember being shocked by this conversation because this was someone who would never initiate a conversation with me.
How was she behaving when she was telling you all these things?
She was visibly upset. She was aggravated with him.
When we return, the defense tries to portray Leslie as the real mastermind, a heartless son who threw his own mother under the bus to save his own skin.
Leslie's the one that did the deed, and that is pretty cold-hearted to put 2 bullet holes in the back of your stepfather's head or anybody.
Prosecutors had accused Vicki Monroe of manipulating her own son into murdering her husband. The defense fought back, arguing that Leslie was just trying to stay off of death row.
Leslie Emerson, whose motivation takes over to wipe out Jerry, it's got nothing to do with my client.
Larry Simon was Vicki Monroe's defense attorney.
Leslie's the one that did the deed, and that is pretty cold-hearted to put 2 bullet holes in the back of your stepfather's head or anybody. Think about it. To save his own skin from a capital murder charge, he's going to put his mom up to take partial responsibility for it.
Simon presented the jury with a much more simple reason to explain Jerry Monroe's murder.
What was his motivation? It wasn't to help his mom out. It was to rob the bar. He's there robbing the bar. The cash register's empty. He cleared out the cigarettes. Did my client have that motivation? No way.
Facing a strong prosecution case, Simon began his defense by attacking the credibility of their witnesses.
How long was your sexual relationship with Mr. Monroe?
It only happened 5 times.
And this is something that you never told Vicki about?
No, sir.
One of the more problematic witnesses Simon had to contend with was a friend of Leslie's who testified for the prosecution.
Could you tell us what you heard her say?
Les had asked her some questions, and she had asked him when was it going to be done, and
what did he say?
he said when we get back.
Your testimony would be you have heard the entire conversation between her and her son. Is that what you're telling us?
Yeah, for the most part, yes.
Well, what do you mean for the most part? Either you did or they didn't. Did they walk away from you?
As far as I remember.
I'm asking him a question. What's for the most part? What do you mean? If it's just a conversation that says, when is this going to get done, if that's what the statement was, there's lots of inferences that you can take.
He also attacked the inferences the prosecution drew from Vicki and Leslie's phone records.
We have the chart, they're over here, about 67 phone calls, blah, blah, blah.
If they had any voicemail messages, they sure weren't reproduced, and many of these calls were unanswered.
The one remaining fact is, we don't know the content of the phone calls.
At the time, I believe that Leslie was doing work at the residence, and so those calls may very well have been relating to jobs. One side can argue one inference, and the other side gets to argue another inference.
But Simon's biggest challenge was overcoming the words of his own client.
She told Leslie that, quote, she couldn't take it anymore and that she wanted it over. In response, Les says, Mom, there's ways of taking care of things. And she responds to that statement by stating, what would it take?
The tape-recorded statement that Vicki Monroe provided to the police was devastating to the defense.
I ain't running away from it, ladies and gentlemen. She assumed that she was expecting something to be done because she gave him $2,000.
It was very, very incriminating, but that's what you have to work with.
So we got her saying she's having a conversation with her son about paying a hitman, basically, if you boil it down to that. We don't know where it took place. We don't know what happened right before or even what happened after. All we know, it was a year or so ago.
It was a point he hit on when cross-examining lead detective Marcy Davis.
Would it be a fair statement to say that other than a year or so ago, there is no time frame indicated in her statements to you for that one conversation?
For that one conversation, yes, that would be a fair statement.
Did you ever try to narrow down a specific time when that conversation took place?
I don't recall.
Okay, let me ask you this. Did you ever ask her where that conversation took place between her and Leslie?
I don't recall.
If she had no intent anymore at the time of the murder, then that should create a reasonable doubt in the juror's mind as to whether or not she had the same intent as Leslie when it came to murdering Jerry.
Over the course of 6 years, prosecutors had tried and failed to hold Vicki Monroe responsible for what they believed to be her role in orchestrating her husband's murder. In their closing arguments, they did not hold back.
There's only one reason why Gerald Monroe will never get on his motorbike again. There's only one reason why he will never put his arms around his daughter. He was a young man. He was just 40-something years old. He had a lot of life to live. He probably had a lot of marriages that he would have had further on in his life. Only one reason why he will never have his grandchildren sit on his knee. And the reason, ladies and gentlemen, sits here.
I see what she did as the ultimate betrayal. You know, as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, what she did to her family is just unspeakable and unthinkable.
It is time today, once and for all, to balance the scales of justice.
I'm standing here, I'm arguing for my client, and I'm arguing that she's innocent.
At the time the murder occurred, my client had no intention of seeing her husband killed. She made those statements and engaged in that conversation with her son a long time before the murder took place.
It was a year or so ago. What's the big deal? As long as she said it, she's guilty. Put the handcuffs on her.
So you do the best you can, and you try to make your points, but ultimately it's up to the 12 people in the box.
Thank you all. We, the jury, find the defendant, Vicki Monroe, guilty under instruction number 1.
I fought and fought and fought for him, and that we're gonna get justice for him, and it's gonna stick this time.
It was very important that there be no appeal because there was closure, first of all, for the family.
After being found guilty of paying her son to murder her husband, Vicki Monroe was sentenced to 25 years in prison. She served just over 10 years and was released in 2019. Her son, Leslie, is still incarcerated at the Fulton County Detention Center. He will be eligible for parole this November. Angel is now a victim services advocate, helping other families who have lost a loved one to violent crime.
He's with me all the time. I have photos of him up in my cubicle so that I never forget that this is why I go out on the calls I go out on. This is why I care about what's happening to someone else. This is the why.
That's all for this week. For more Court TV original productions, check out the show notes where you can find links to stream them all for free on the Court TV website. And you can see me on my shows, Closing Arguments with Vinnie Politan every weeknight at 8 p.m. Eastern, and Vinnie Politan Investigates at 9 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for downloading, and as always, please don't forget to hug the kids.
This podcast is a production of Court TV. Go to CourtTV.com for more content, trials on demand, and to find out how to watch Court TV in your area.